Welcome to the School of Journalism and Communication at Carleton University. My name is Alan Thompson. I'm the head of the journalism program here at Carleton and sort of your host tonight. This is our student resource center, and it does double duty as an event space. I want to begin, as we always do at Carleton, by acknowledging that we are situated on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Nation. Those are just words. You hear them a lot at events these days. I also try to be more intentional and to encourage everyone to think about wherever you live, whatever territory you live on, how you relate to that land, how you understand that land, and those who have been here for eons, and also the intention. What are you doing in terms of talking about acknowledgement and reconciliation? So at Carleton, we're very aware that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission made abundantly clear that journalism really has a key role to play in reconciliation. We've taken that on board. We've adopted every recommendation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission about the role of the media, added it to our curriculum, to our coursework, but also we've launched a unique program, the Certificate in Journalism in Indigenous Communities. One of the reasons we have very few Indigenous students in our program at Carleton. There are a lot of barriers to heading off to university to study journalism. So recognizing that, we've established a program that's in its first year and has 17 students where they are taught basic journalism skills in community, remotely, online, but have gathered together twice for 1 week intensive sessions, and we'll have a third intensive session here at Carleton in May, and then receive their certificate. And some people may head off to explore careers in journalism based on that 1 year certificate, but they also have a chance, if they wish to come and study journalism at Carleton, they get credit for those courses, their Carleton courses, and they can then explore, do I want to move to Carleton, to Ottawa, and pursue journalism studies. So that's something that we're doing. So thank you to our guest tonight, Theresa O'Leary, for adding to our knowledge of journalism history. It's not every day that you can create knowledge that wasn't there before, and for offering really to do this event here tonight. Thanks to our tech staff and 2 of our journalism students who are recording the event, so if you want to watch it later, if you want to share it with anyone, we have all of your details from the registration, so we'll share the recording of this event. Finally, I'm grateful to Carleton's bookstore, represented here tonight by Jeremy, for getting us some copies of the book, and those are here. They're available on sale, and Theresa will do some signing later on for those who want to personalize the book. After I introduce Theresa properly, we'll talk a little bit about the book. Then she will read some passages from Race to the Cape before we open the floor to your questions. And I will have a microphone. I can run around and give people a chance. That way your voice is on the recording when you ask a question. The publicity for the event tonight made clear, Theresa has added to our knowledge of journalism history and the Canadian connection with a book that chronicles a key moment in the history of journalism, a moment that changed how the world gets its news. In Race to the Cape, she transports us to a time when speed, accuracy, and objectivity became paramount, and unravels this incredible true story behind the creation of what we now know as the Associated Press, which creates the template for wire service, neutral, fact-based reporting and journalism. And there's a very interesting surprising in a way, Canadian connection to the birth of the Associated Press. I'm not going to tell you more about the story because that is Theresa's job, so let me tell you more about her. Theresa O'Leary was born and raised in Newfoundland. Her family has its roots in Portugal Cove South, a small community very close to Cape Race. She started her journalism career as a freelancer with CBC Radio in St. John's, Newfoundland, fresh out of Memorial University with a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science. We will forgive her for not coming to Carleton to study journalism. She really did think about it, she has told me. A year after graduation, she started as a full-time news reporter for CBC Radio in Prince Rupert, BC. Within a year, she won a Gabriel Award for coverage of the Haida blockade on Lyle Island in Haida Gwaii, formerly known as the Queen Charlotte Islands. That reporting was a great example of a Theresa sort of stock and trade, boots on the ground journalism, in the field, not in the office. On the international front, Theresa covered the LA riots in 1992 for CBC, the migrant crisis in Italy. In Montreal, she covered the courts at the Palais de Justice for some years, including what must have been grueling, the 5-month trial of mass murderer Valérie Fabricant. After 20 or so years of news reporting for national radio news, she wrote and produced a number of documentaries for CBC Radio's Tapestry program, and she's also a filmmaker. She's here tonight to talk about her first book, Race to the Cape, which grows out of the family lore, really, about the AP news boat and the fact that a relative of hers, her great aunt Kitty, once worked in the telegraph station at Cape Race. So I want Theresa to walk us through this story and help us understand its significance. So Theresa, welcome.
Thank you so
Carleton.
much. It's wonderful to be here.
Glad you finally got to Carleton.
Yes, indeed.
Begin by telling us about what brought you to this story.
Okay, well, it does go back to my childhood. My father would tell me this story over and over again. He would say, oh, the AP had a news boat at Cape Race chasing after the news that was being thrown overboard by the steamships coming from England. And as a child, I envisioned newspapers floating on the ocean, of course, because you're literal, you're a child. When I became a journalist in my early 20s, I did go to McGill University and went into the archives there. This was pre-internet. And found some newspaper articles that confirm that there actually was a news boat that the AP had stationed at this remote location, and it was all true what Dad had told me. So that was astounding to me. Of course, I tucked it away. I was just starting my career in journalism, so it took me, 40 years later, I got back to the book. But that's really what drove it. And
just
yes.
So people understand the times,
Yes.
Why was it necessary for people to go out in boats and get these canisters of news that were coming off steamships?
Well, at that time, there was no transatlantic telegraph. So the news that came from England came by steamships. And at that time in history, people were really still very focused on what was going on in England and Europe. That's where the foreign news was really the news in the beginning, before the telegraph. And so the AP in New York City wanted first access to the news from England and from Europe. And Cape Race was the place to be because it was first landfall in North America for ships leaving England and Europe. And it still is today. Ships will navigate with Cape Race in their sights, and they'll go around Cape Race and either go up the St. Lawrence Seaway to Montreal and Quebec City, or they'll go down south to Boston and New York City. And so the general manager of the Telegraph in 1856, his name was Daniel Craig, he wanted to do it for years, but it took him till 1856. That's when the lighthouse went in. Just so everybody knows, this image right here is this is an image from 1861. No. Yeah. Yeah, we could stick with that if you want, or you want to go to the next one?
Whatever you want.
Okay, so just wanted people to notice, this is an 1861 image that was in the London Times. So it's not artwork. I mean, it is, but it was done in 1861. That's the steamships coming from England. You see all the rocks and how dangerous it is there? So they can't anchor. They just slow down when they would come to Cape Race. Then they would throw these canisters with mail and news from England overboard into those tormented seas, as you can see there. On the left-hand side is the AP news boat with Captain Murphy and 4 of his crew. And up on the cliff there, that's the lighthouse and the telegraph. There's a little hut right next to the telegraph, if you notice. And that's where the AP news boat crew lived and worked from for about 10 years, chasing after these news canisters. They would go out in any kind of weather, they would get the news canisters, they would go back up to the lighthouse and they would telegraph the news to New York City. So the news would get to Daniel Craig on Broadway in New York City in a matter of hours as opposed to days when the ships would arrive. So that was the motivation. It was basically the same as the craziness that we're involved in today. We think the faster we get the news, the better it will be, right? And that's what they believe too. It's very dangerous though.
And just to go back, the New York Associated Press came into existence because a number of these papers came together and decided, let's not spend all this money chasing individually after news with the Telegraph and the Pony Express, and we needed a service that we can all use.
Yes, absolutely. Well, before the telegraph was invented and launched in 1844, media was newspapers. That was it. There was no tech media. And so when the telegraph was invented, it was like, it's been dubbed the Victorian Internet because it triggered such a change in society and journalism. And when they got together in 1844 was when the telegraph was launched. 2 years later, the fees were very expensive to use the telegraph. Mexican War was on the southern front of the United States, and the New York newspapers wanted that news. So they were all spending a fortune on Pony Expresses, getting the news to the telegraph line and getting it north to New York City. As a result of their frugal mindedness, I will say that, all of the newspapers, half a dozen of the newspapers got together, and they didn't want to pay these expensive fees for each of them to get a report or a dispatch. So they decided for a loose coalition. They came together in 1846, and it was just for the Mexican War, though. At that point, there was no intention to build the AP. It was just, let's save some money, get the news from the war front. But what was really interesting about that decision, and it was accidental, really, it came out of it organically, is that these guys were trying to save money. They weren't looking at the telegraph as a way to expand their operations, right? And so when they came together and they decided, okay, we're going to get one dispatch from the war front, what it meant is that there could be no opinion in it. Now before, those newspapers I mentioned, they were, back in the day, owned by powerful political rich men with differing opinions, right? So they would have disagreed if there was any opinion in the dispatch that came in. Those guys would have been arguing. So in order for it to work, opinion had to be removed, and only the facts could be transmitted to the newspapers through the AP. And that's how fact-based news actually came into existence, which is remarkable to me when I found that out, because when I was working as a journalist, I never really thought to myself, when did it begin? I just thought it was always happening. I thought we always had objectivity in news, you know, but this period changed everything. And it was the telegraph that triggered it all, the technology. It created capacity for expansion. But these guys were thinking about shrinkage, just like today with these, you know, powerful media moguls today. All they think about is cutting, slashing, cutting, slashing. Meanwhile, they have this internet, which is, you know, they could expand and expand and expand and make more money. But their minds were set on that.
And when or how did you learn about Daniel Craig, the journalist who essentially turned this into the Associated Press? And he's a central character in the book.
And you're right. He really, in my opinion, you know, he's not listed as the founder of the AP, but honestly, I believe he is, because he was a freelance journalist who was working in Boston. And he was chasing after the news that was coming, because those steamships, they would come by Cape Race, they would throw over some canisters, but they would continue on into Boston and New York, right? And they still had news on board. So he was in Boston, and he would go out every morning, hire a rowboat, and he had a basket of carrier pigeons, and that was his special tool. And he'd go out to these steamships, and he'd climb on board, he'd talk to the captain and the mail officer, look at any news publications in print that was were on board. And then he would write tiny little notes on little tiny pieces of basically headlines. It was really headline news because there wasn't like you could write a story. So just little pieces of he would put that into a tube attached to the claws of his carrier pigeons, and then he would, as they approached Boston, he would send it off to shore. And his wife, Helena, was there waiting for the news. And then she would receive the bird, take the messages out, and go up to the telegraph station and send it off to New York. And one of the biggest pieces of information they wanted was the price of cotton, right? That was a huge piece of information the investors in New York wanted. And he always seemed to manage to get that information before the AP. And so the New York newspapers were watching him, and they were not liking that he kept beating them every time. And James Bennett from the New York Herald, he called him the unbeatable Daniel Craig. And as a result of his ability and his drive, in 1848, when the AP formalized their organization and called it the New York Associated Press and incorporated it, they hired him to go to Halifax as their first correspondent on foreign soil. And he was in Halifax for about a year, and there was a pony express that went from Halifax to Digby, Nova Scotia, and then across the river on the ferry to St. John, New Brunswick, because there was no telegraph going from St. John to Halifax. So St. John was the northern terminus. So this is what he did for about a year. And again, he was doing such an amazing job. The guys in New York said, we have to bring him to New York. So they brought him to New York in 1850. And when the AP had formed, just to show the frugal mindedness of these guys, in 1848, they hired one guy to do the job and an assistant. And this guy, Alexander Jones, was working night and day, 6 to 7 days a week. And by the time Craig arrived, he was exhausted, and he quit soon after. And it was obvious then that Daniel Craig had the vision, for it. Yeah, so they hired him then as the general manager. And like you say, then he transformed things.
And he essentially takes this idea on the road, tours major cities on the U.S. Eastern Seaboard, but also in Canada.
In Canada as well, that's
to essentially create bureaus for the New York Associated Press to build the network.
That's exactly what he did. I mean, it was the first thing that he did was present a proposal to the AP board that he was going to go on a tour of 14 North American cities, including Halifax, Montreal, Toronto, and St. John, New Brunswick. And he did do that. And what he was, of course, lining up business for the AP, of course. But he also, by 1851, when he took over, and this was like, okay, that's 7 years after it was launched. The telegraph news was a mess. What was moving on the wires? There was crap news, there was fake news, there was baloney news, there was so much moving on the wire.
Sounds very familiar.
It does. It's very similar to today, right? Yes. And so he was disgusted with that. And he went around to these 14 cities in North America, met with the editors and newspaper owners in those places. And he found that everybody agreed with him that what was happening was terrible. It was a mess. They had this great capacity to communicate, but it was being turned into, similar to the internet today. So he came back from that and he proposed to the AP Board of Directors. He said the answer was for them to, if they wanted good news moving on the wires, they had to hire people, correspondents, in these 14 locations. And they had to be, it was men, of course, men of good quality, and they would be paid liberal salaries. I just think that's really important to note. If there's any media person in the world, in the room, if you want good news, you have to pay for it. And he knew it, and that's what he presented to them. And so that was his first sort of step that he took within months of taking over. And there are he wrote a lot of stuff in the newspapers, he wrote letters to all of the authorities in those places, and then he also wrote in the newspaper what he was proposing. So there was a lot of information around about that.
Had anyone in the room heard of Daniel Craig before you heard about this event, or a couple?
Yeah,
Not 007. Yes, not 007.
Yeah, right. Well, it's interesting because when I approached the AP in 2016, when I started researching the book, they did not know very much about Daniel Craig, and they knew nothing about the Cape Race operation.
And here I learned, 1844, the day of the first demonstration of the telegraph, when Morse was in Washington.
That's right.
And
Vail
was
in Baltimore.
Baltimore.
And that's where Craig was at the time.
In that room, Craig was in the room
He was.
when the first message, tick, 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 what hath God wrought,
Yeah.
is read out by.
Yeah.
So that piece of journalism about the creation of the Victorian internet, that story was broken by Daniel Craig,
Basically.
who you go on to. He's
Yeah.
the character. He's the character that brings this book alive.
Yes, and there's a great section in the beginning of the book that I won't go into the detail about when he was in Baltimore before he went to Boston. And that's where he really learned how to manage the carrier pigeons from the editor and owner of the Baltimore Sun. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce his name, but I think it's Aruna Abel. And anyway, so there's some great stuff in there about really when he was learning to be a journalist, because he was a printer's apprentice originally. He was hired as a printer's apprentice by Abel. But very quickly he showed promise, and Abel started using him as basically as a news correspondent.
So as a journalist, I'm just curious about the research, the fact finding
Yeah, right.
behind this book. You spent years in archives. Can you just take us through some of that journey
Sure.
of researching the story?
Sure, absolutely. Because it was a journey, and I think all research is a journey, and you find things out in the strangest places sometimes. First of all, I reached out to the AP. All their stuff had been digitized, so I wanted to go into their boxes and see if I could find out some stuff about the Cape Race operation. But basically everything that they had been put, had already been digitized. They did give me one amazing piece of, it was a real gem. It was the 1862 annual report of the AP. And in it, he details the success of the Cape Race operation with numbers about what they were paid and how much it cost and so on. So that was really great. From there, I learned that there were 2 books that had been written about the AP. Only 2 books, actually, in this whole 175-year history. One of them was written in 1950. It was called The AP Story of News. And it was written by a guy who had complete access to the AP archives at that time. But that was 100 years after the time that I'm writing about, when it started. So, it's a primary source because it's so old. That provided some great stuff. The second book was written 44 years later by a man named Menachem Blondheim, and he was a Harvard professor, and it was called News Over the Wires. And he really focused on it through the lens of business and monopolies, so not so much the journalistic, but he had amazing research material in his work for me. And I did contact him as well directly for some clarification around facts, so that was really great. After that, it was mostly digital archive of the various places that were involved, the university. So, and then I did about a year online, but then I had to go to the archives because the archivists will only do so much research for you. So I had to go to New York, and I had New York City Public Library, St. John's, Newfoundland, the Rooms, Nova Scotia Public Archives, Ottawa National Public Archives, England, anyway, the whole bunch of archives. So I did that. I didn't travel to all those places, but I did Newfoundland and New York City. And and then I also went to Cape Race, of course, and I went back to Portugal Cove South, which is the community that's near Cape Race, and where my relatives, my O'Leary clan, are from. And so I went back there, of course, and I did direct research by talking to people in the community, talking to the local historians, the amateur historians, the people with family stories. That's also really as important as the official research, if you will. I just wanted to say, and when you're researching, it's amazing the pathways that show up. So when I started researching this book, I wanted to know a few questions answered. Who put the news boat at Cape Race and why? And who were the guys in the boat? I knew the captain was Captain John Murphy. That was recorded in the history of Newfoundland by David Prowse. But the 4 guys there weren't named, and I really wanted to give them their due. So I did deep research in the archives and digitally and in the archives, and I could not find that information. And 2 years into it, I really was starting to feel like, I don't think I'm going to find it. I might have to tell this story without this key piece of information. But then, thank goodness for social media. I know we all hate it, but honestly, it's good sometimes. Because on Facebook, I was complaining about the fact, just to my audience or whatever, my page people, my friends, that I couldn't find it. And Bob was a friend of a friend, Bob Moulton. Sorry, I'm forward. This is Bob Moulton right
Ladies and
here.
gentlemen, Bob Moulton.
This is Bob Moulton. And Bob noticed that I was having this conversation, and he came onto the page and asked me what I was writing about. And I told him that I was looking for the names of those guys, and he said, I have the names of those guys. And it turns out that Bob and I are second cousins. Anyway, Bob's father, great-grandfather was great-great-grandfather was John Henderson, and he was one of the guys in the boat. And so again, you just never know where the information is going to come from. But I will also add, on the day before my book went to print, that's when it's only then, last year, that I found out that we're related, that John Henderson married an O'Leary. I mean, her name was Curtis, but she was an O'Leary. And so my great-grandfather was likely at their wedding, because John got married to Susan Curtis during this period. Yeah. So anyway, so that was a really fabulous piece of personal information that came through somebody who had it in their family history. So thank you, Bob.
There's a great story in the book also about the shipwreck.
Yes.
This huge event. Tell us
Yes.
more about that.
Yes, well, this is the thing that, as you can tell by this, Cape Race is a very dangerous place. And it's known as the graveyard of the Atlantic for a reason. There are many, many steamship wrecks around that area throughout that period. In 1863, so it's during the period of the race to the Cape, the Anglo-Saxon was coming across, and it wrecked at a cove a bit north of Cape Race. 238 people died, and there was a big official inquiry into it. And the AP newsboat crew, Murphy and the guys, as well as the lighthouse keeper, they were the ones who rescued the people from that shipwreck. And the AP in New York City were involved. They were telegraphing news back and forth, and Daniel Craig approved a ship coming from St. John's down to Cape Race to look for survivors. So they didn't just report the news in that case, they actually kind of became part of it. But one thing that's interesting about the shipwreck is that there was an official inquiry in England, and a lot of people in the papers were demanding that they put, what do you call that? A foghorn, a sound for the ships. Sorry, excuse me, I'm getting off on track. In that ship, there were only enough lifeboats for the wealthy, for the first-class passengers. That's why so many people died. So a lot of people were demanding that they put enough lifeboats on a ship to make sure everybody could get off. The official inquiry refused to deal with that and say anything about that. 60 years later, the Titanic happened, 400 miles off of this coast, southeast of this point, and 1,500 people died. And it was only after that that the English government changed things and made it law, right? So it was kind of interesting because, Titanic might have been prevented if that had changed in 1863.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Before I ask you to read, I did, so those who get a chance to read the book, one thing you'll notice, this is described as a work of creative nonfiction.
That's right.
A traditional work of nonfiction would have quotations, footnotes. This thing was said by this person at this time.
Right.
In this case, you've chosen a literary device where you reconstruct
Yes.
So you don't say that the New York Herald reported that on this day it was this weather. You just say,
Right.
He rolled out of bed and looked outside and it was sunny and walked down the street and dialogue. There are conversations
Right.
among characters that
Yes.
you've reconstructed. And I'm just wondering about, especially in a book about hard facts, the choice to try to bring this to life by reconstructing dialogue and putting quotation marks around it.
It's interesting you asked that question because that was the hardest part for me, because when I wrote the first draft, it was more like a master's thesis with lots of quotes and dense with facts and information. And when I managed to get a publisher, the publisher and the editor, you know, they really taught me how to write creative nonfiction, because I'd written nonfiction, but this was creative nonfiction, and I really resisted because I'm a total fact-based gal. I've been working as a news reporter for 40-something years. And so it took a while, and they would say, could you turn this scene, could you turn this into a scene and put some dialogue in it? And I'd say, no. And they'd come back gently and say, well, what about it, business? And so they taught me that I could make reasonable deductions or assumptions about, like, okay, let me just say with Daniel Craig and his wife. This was really, I guess, what convinced me I could do it. Helena was very involved in the work in Boston and in Halifax. And so I thought it was reasonable to think that when Daniel Craig was coming home from work, he would talk to his wife about his work, and they might have conversations about what was happening. I thought that was reasonable. So that's where I started, and creating those conversations between them. But all of what was put into the quotes for dialogue came from my research.
Okay.
So it was research-based, but then it was put into the mouths of people. Like, there's dialogue in there that really, like, Craig had written all these documents about his vision. I took that and put that into his mouth, in dialogue. So that was a really big learning curve for me. And as I said, I resisted it all the way along. I'm sure I drove my editors nuts. But I did become more comfortable with it as I did it more and more. But every step of the way when they would ask me, I really had to consider it. Okay, is this going into the creative side too much? Just trying to think of another example. But anyway, yeah, so that really was a difficult thing for me. But I did understand that what their goal was to make history and make facts more accessible to more people. And that's why they wanted to focus on the story. And so that's what we tried to turn it into more of a story. And the other thing that I was resisting too is that Daniel Craig was the main character, and that was obvious, but I was writing this book as a Newfoundlander, and this was Newfoundland history that was close to home. So I sort of wanted to start in Newfoundland, and you know what I mean, not start in Baltimore with Daniel Craig. And originally I did start with the shipwreck. But my editors and publisher convinced me that doing it chronologically would be better for everybody when they were reading it, because there was so much history involved. And so I did agree to that. So thank God for good editors and publishers.
Why don't you read for us? Read the passages that you would you've chosen, and then we'll give you a chance to ask some questions.
Oh yeah, just on the sources too. I read a lot of books. I read a lot of books because I had to learn all about the Atlantic Telegraph, the transatlantic telegraph, and the electric telegraph. And another thing that we use in modern days, city directories. There were city directories back then, and I did use those. And in fact, I was able to find out some information through an English archivist about Helena's family story, because she actually had come to Boston. Craig was born in the States, but she came from England as a child. Anyway. Okay, so I'm going to start in chapter 5, and it is called The Fact-Based News. And this will be probably about 3-4 minutes, and then the other ones will be a little bit shorter. So we are in New York City, and we are in Boston in this little section. start in New York City. Telegraph fees were being driven higher and higher by telegraph companies involved in their own bitter legal conflicts. David Hale from the Journal of Commerce, which would become the Wall Street Journal, worried the price was going to keep rising. With no government supervision, he told the group of news editors, newspapers will be forced to surrender the vital function of news gathering, and the news itself will become merely a commodity, unreliable and purely commercial. Another major concern was the fact that there was still only one telegraph line available to all the New York newspapers. The terminus of the line was in New Jersey across the Hudson River. Each newspaper could use the line for 15 minutes at a time to send their news, and each paid the full rate. It just made no business sense. So the 6 newspaper owners in New York City agreed. If they had an organization that gathered the telegraph news for all of them at the same time, it would benefit each of their publications. It was at this pivotal meeting in 1848 that the owners and editors gave the new group a formal name, the New York Associated Press, NYAP, an innovation in news arriving from the telegraph, a newswire agency serving many different clients or newspapers. They incorporated the NYAP and would cover all important news, including the foreign news, arriving by steamship from England. There was no telegraph connecting the continents yet, so mail delivery was still arriving by ship. To the east of the city, just outside Sandy Hook, steamships waited patiently for the pilot boat to escort them into New York Harbor. The NYAP Board of Directors decided they could only afford to hire one man to carry out the work, Alexander Jones, a medical doctor by training, but with some experience in news gathering on both sides of the Atlantic. As the pioneering general agent, he was expected to find and set up an office and to collect and distribute the news. Jones quickly selected an office on the 4th floor of a building on Liberty Street. He noted that regrettably each day his new job would start with a climb up 4 flights of stairs in a dimly lit stairwell. There were no elevators yet. However, the room where he worked was large. More importantly, the price was right. Rent was under $500 US a month. Jones' salary was $20 a week. The NYAP's infant news operation cost between $10,000 and $20,000 in its first year. That included an assistant to share the heavy workload. Payment for foreign news was the largest single expense, as most news that mattered still happened in England and Europe. And accessing that news was crucial. From his base in Boston, Daniel Craig was observing the shift toward a wire-driven news system in New York. He was doing a fine business himself, chasing the foreign news arriving on longliners because he was located closer to Europe than New York. Craig was well known to James Bennett, Moses Beach, and the other New York editors. He had beaten them many times in delivering vital news from the steamships. Bennett often referred to Craig as unbeatable. One of the first things the NYAP did was to charter a boat called the Buena Vista to intercept all vessels arriving from Europe at Halifax, Nova Scotia. The boat's job was then to obtain the latest news and rush it south to Boston, where it could be telegraphed to New York. There was not yet a telegraph line connecting New York City and Halifax. Unbeknownst to Bennett and the NYAP, Craig secretly started using the Buena Vista to travel north along the eastern seaboard to Halifax, where he would intercept the delivery meant for the Associated Press. With a spring in his step, he would walk the wharf in downtown Halifax and hire a rowboat to take him to the steamships anchored in the harbor. He would speak to the captains and crew for any urgent news, then read any newspapers or news digests on board. Craig did not want to be recognized by anyone who might know the Associated Press directors, so he kept to himself. Once on board for the return trip south, he would stay in his cabin, working, reading all the news he'd collected, and writing short messages on small slips of tissue paper to insert them into the tiny tubes attached to his carrier pigeon's legs. Craig would be ready to send the messengers up in the sky as soon as the Massachusetts coastlines emerged on the horizon, their wings flapping frantically as they flew home to their destination. Helena, pregnant with their second child, knew when the Buena Vista was scheduled to arrive, would go to the wharf awaiting the bird's arrival, regardless of the weather. She demonstrated that she was a worthy partner and able competitor. Perhaps she had her own news instincts, that inner compulsion to chase information. Perhaps she simply enjoyed the intrigue. Helena's motivations for helping with the carrier pigeon and rowboat news were not as clear as her husband's, but she understood the importance and urgency of getting the news to the telegraph office for transmission to clients in New York. Many days at an early hour, she would be at the wharf to receive a pigeon on her gloved forearm. She would gently retrieve the tube from the bird's claws, then immediately take off at a quick pace for the telegraph office to transmit the most recent news and information from Europe. In New York, Bennett was more frustrated than ever with Craig's ability to beat him. He sent a telegram off to the Buena Vista's captain ordering him to capture Craig's birds the next time he boarded at Halifax to prevent him from sending out a pigeon post. But the wily Craig was well ahead of his competitors in New York. "I went on deck and flew the bird close to the captain's head," he would later recall. The captain's eyes narrowed as the pigeon flew past. He ran into his stateroom and grabbed his rifle, but before he had a chance to fire a shot at the bird, it was a mile above him, well on its way to delivering Craig's message. As Craig recounted this story to Helena at home over dinner later that evening, he laughed with glee. "I had a feeling Bennett would be up to something, so I tucked one valuable bird in my pocket as I boarded." So that was Mr. Craig. Took a lot of initiative, had a lot of drive. So after this, he was, impressing them so much, they hired him, as I said, to go to Halifax and be the first correspondent for the AP on foreign soil. He was there for about a year and did the Pony Express, and again was succeeding so much they brought him to New York. Then, as we discussed, in New York, he went out on this tour of the 14 cities, came back and proposed hiring these correspondents throughout North America. And one of the first hires was a man named Lawrence Gobright, and he was hired as the first correspondent for the AP in Washington, D.C. And I have a great quote from Lawrence. I got to keep this one. Mm-hmm. He actually told this to a congressional committee. This quote is from a congressional committee hearing. "My business is to communicate facts. My instructions do not allow me to make any comments upon the facts which I communicate. My dispatches are sent to papers of all manner of politics, and the editors say they are able to make their own comments upon the facts which are sent to them." Gobright promised to confine himself to covering what he considered legitimate news. "I do not act as a politician belonging to any school, but try to be truthful and impartial. My dispatches are a merely dry matter of fact and detail." So I just love that because it really summarizes what the AP was all about from the very beginning. Fact-based news, nonpartisan mindset, the neutral mindset of the good journalist, which is essential in a democracy, as we've discovered in recent times. Mm-hmm. So the final section I will read is at Cape Race. And this is the story of, those guys operating that news operation right there in those dangerous waters. There was nowhere around the iron-bound coast of sheer cliffs to drop anchor, so the steamship's mail officers filled canisters with important messages and threw them overboard while passing Cape Race. If the water was calm enough during the day and they had leeway in their schedule, the steamers would stop long enough for Murphy to climb aboard and speak with the captains. On those rare fine days when Murphy did so, the shipmasters greeted him with open arms. Because of the cable across the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the landline to Port aux Basques, he could bring them the latest news and fresh fish, meaning fresh caught. Ships passing at night would throw the canisters blindly in the ocean, hoping the NYAP crew would find them. When morning light broke, Murphy and the boys would go fishing for news canisters. The green, slender cans had small ropes attached to the side and flags, which were meant to assist in finding them as they were tossed around by the waves. Once the crew spotted a canister in the ocean and rowed close to it, Henderson leaned over the side of the boat and used his rough hands to haul in the fishing line. And then he unhooked the jig from the rope on the can with its red flag flapping madly in the wind. The traditional cod fishing hook used by fishermen was as effective at jigging for news. "Gotcha, ya bloody Slevene," he yelled as he hauled the ice-cold canister out of the salt water. The catch of the day slipped through his fingers, landing with a bang on the flat bottom of the whaling boat. The 5 men were not hunting whales today, though, nor were they fishing for cod, the slippery prey so abundant along the coast of charcoal cliffs of Cape Race. Just as the mail canister bounced, a huge swell rose and crashed against the side of the boat. Murphy lurched forward, managing to grab hold of the metal missive with both hands. The 4 oarsmen hung on to the sides, waiting for the swell to subside. The Atlantic seemed more tormented than usual, heaving and sighing and heaving again, enough to make any man sick to his stomach. But that was nothing new for this crew, with well-seasoned sea legs, known from Newfoundland to New York City for their commitment and daring in gathering the news. Within seconds, the five were sitting upright again, not troubled at all by the foggy, windy, rainy weather. Just a typical April day in the late 1850s along the southern shore of the Avalon Peninsula. Their traditional sou'westers dripped salt water onto their tongues. Their oilskin jackets looked as weathered as any fisherman's. From a distance, few would have guessed they were not fishing for cod. That day, there would be no going on board the steamship from Liverpool to chat with the captain and catch up on important news. After throwing the mail overboard, the vessel had continued on its way south to Montreal or Halifax or Boston or New York. Murphy gave the signal to his crew to turn around and row back to shore, where high above them the tiny telegraph hut sat beside the towering Cape Race lighthouse. They grabbed hold of the oars and put their backs into generating enough power to move toward shore, despite the unrelenting waves. According to Henderson, throughout the day and night they were on call. 5 men continually on the watch for foreign mail steamers, he would recall. When any such steamer would heave in sight, we should launch the boat, which when the weather would be rough was attended with great danger. Some of those steamers would never stop. When near us, we would hear someone shout, "Look out!" and over would go a canister, sealed and containing the latest news from Europe.
Wow.
Yeah, unbelievable, hey? Unbelievable story.
How is it possible that no one has told this story up until now?
It's a really good question. It's a really good question. You know, I think, well, I think it's, this is what I think. I think it's because technologies move in fast and change things quickly. The ending of the book, which I won't reveal, I don't want to spoil it for people, but the ending of the book is also technologically driven. There's another technological advance that happens at the end of the book, and that changes everything, and it moves on really quickly, and there's a surprising end to Daniel Craig's career, right? And I think that's what happened. It's just like now, you know, where it's just coming so fast and furious, and it moves on, and who can remember what happened 10 years ago, right? That's my theory, but I really don't know. I mean, it's a very good question because I only knew about it because my dad told me, right? When I did the research in Newfoundland, in Prowse's History of Newfoundland, there's one line about this. That's it, one line. And he said something like, no one could imagine the daring it took for Captain John Murphy and his crew to do this. So, you know, he'd identified that right then and there what it was. It was a daring news chase. Luckily, I did not find, now it could have happened, but I did not find any reports of anybody getting hurt. So there's that, which is interesting because, you know, it's pretty dangerous, except for the shipwreck, of course.
Yeah.
But in terms of the crew, but again, this was very early history, so there wasn't really a lot to find, you know. The AP had a fire, so they'd lost a bunch of documents. Newfoundland Archives had also had fires in Newfoundland, lost information. So And I mean, there may be more detailed information out there than I found, but you know, you can only do so much research, so.
Well, thank you for doing this. Thank you for bringing it here. I
Thank
touch
you.
on this period briefly in a class that Will was in about sort of the history of journalism from the printing press to the modern day. But this is really valuable, and thank you. And so I want to give people a chance. We have a microphone. I will walk around the room with this microphone so that people are more comfortable to ask questions. So we have lots of time for questions. So does anyone have one? Okay. And so I will just
Okay.
make sure I'm not tied to anything. I'll keep track of who's who, and I will pass the microphone.
Okay. It's Randy.
Hi, Randy.
I'm one of the journalism profs here. I take it was about maybe a decade or so, or how long was it that
Yes.
the news yacht, as I see it referred to a few
That's
times
right.
in the book,
Yes.
was active? About a decade?
About a decade, from 1856 to 1866.
Okay.
Yes.
And during that time, I guess there must be specific examples of news stories that unit serving the NYAP were able to get a jump on the competition. Were there ones that stood out? I mean, probably the biggest one was the shipwreck itself.
The shipwreck itself, for sure, but there was also, when they were doing the transatlantic telegraph, when they were creating that, there was the first attempt at that in 1858. There was a message that came from the Queen to the President.
Oh.
And it was dropped off at Cape Race, to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah.
And it was transmitted, telegraphed down to Daniel Craig in New York. And then he sent it on to Lawrence Gobright in Washington. And there is a great scene in the book in which the president and a bunch of the other representatives were sitting around, and it was a hot summer night, and Lawrence Gobright comes in with this telegraph. Oh no, a young man comes in with the telegraph, like a boy comes in with the telegraph. And it's from the Queen, and it's about the transatlantic telegraph and how it's happening, and there's connections happening between, you know, England and North America. And they don't believe it. They don't believe it at all. And so they send him back to get Lawrence Gobright, who is, as I mentioned. And so Lawrence comes in and says, indeed, this is true. And so that was one example.
Right.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. But there weren't a ton of examples because I couldn't really find a lot around those details. Yeah. So.
Cool. How frequently were they getting canisters? Was this something that would happen daily or monthly? How often were ships dropping them?
Yes, I had to get this out and look up these facts and write them down because I can't remember everything I wrote. But in the 1862 annual report, Daniel Craig says that they have doubled from 1861 to 1862. See, in 1861, they had 34 news reports coming from Cape Race. In 1862, it was about 60. So it had doubled in a year. And the one thing to realize is that during that time, really the activity was really mostly from April, May to October, November. Because during the winter, the steamships, some did go across, but it was fairly dangerous, and most of them didn't, you know. So they received, in this annual report for 1862, they received 60 reports, and it cost them $18,000 US. But the salaries are interesting. The salaries of the guys in the boat, $60 a week is what they got. So $240 US a month they were earning to do that work. Not too bad, really, when you think about it. That was the thing with the telegraph, like with all technology, right? When it comes in, there's money to be made. It's true, yeah.
Mr. Lawrence Wall had a question.
Theresa, you mentioned that the AP started to bring in stories from the Mexican War.
Yes.
And then there seems to be a gap where the war has ended and then it's revived again. What happened in those interim years?
Well, I don't really know exactly what happened, except that in 1846, when they formed it was just a loose coalition originally, just to cover the Mexican War. And once that was over, it isn't clear if they were meeting and talking throughout that 2-year period, but by 1848, they came back together, or they came together, and they decided that they would incorporate it and they would make it the NYAP. So I'm not really exactly sure what was going on in that period, but I do know that the move towards objectivity had begun even before the Telegraph started amongst the editors and the papers. They were starting to kind of think about doing things for the public good, like the Baltimore Sun, for instance. Their motto still is today, light for all. And that was their motto when they were formed in 1837. So there was kind of like a little bit of an emerging focus on that, but then when the Telegraph came in, it really defined it and brought it into focus.
Part two.
Sure.
When I was at Carleton many, many years ago, we learned that the Canadian press started in, I think, in 1917.
That's right.
And that they also had this model that it was just the facts, ma'am, because there were liberal newspapers, there were conservative newspapers, and if you allowed opinion to enter, then one newspaper would never accept what the other would find completely fine.
Absolutely.
So did the Canadian press model its operation on the AP or
Yes.
perhaps on Reuters?
No, Reuters came later. Reuters came after the AP. I think it was 1851 is when Reuters came in. Yeah, that they sorry, I'm just having a blank here. Lawrence, can you just ask that question again?
Yeah, if CP, Canadian Press,
Right, they did. The CP did. They based their idea at that time of how it should work on the success of the AP. But I don't know a lot about that period, of course, because that was later than what I was researching. Alan probably knows more about the 1970 stuff because he's, teaches that. But
What
I
I
was
do know
quite
about-
interested to find out, Alan, that it was so much later. I mean, we're talking 1850 in New York City, late 1840s. Why did it take till 1917 in Canada for us to adopt that model? I don't know if you know the answer to
My
that.
theory is the Halifax explosion.
Meaning?
That's when it happened.
Well, actually, I think it had
And
to
the
do with
First World War, the coverage of the First World War. There was
coverage of the First World War.
a desire to have coverage that was fact-based, that everyone could use, and that was really the beginnings of the Canadian press.
Good book by Gene Allen at the TNA, right?
I mean, wouldn't newspapers in Canada have been
Yes, he wrote about AP
Yeah.
later. That's right. Yes, indeed. Yes.
And that U.S.-Mexico war that was a pivotal point for the beginnings of AP was also the first instance of photographs being taken and used for news purposes, photographs of that conflict. There's a question here.
So I'm very curious about the objectivity angle of this.
Sure.
Because when you think of the sort of the route of exchange, so we're starting with newspapers, so they're secondary sources to begin with. They're not a primary source. It's not somebody who's done the interview in England who's giving the information
Right.
to the gentleman on the boat,
Right.
who then distills it down to something that goes on the pigeon's leg.
Yes.
And then it goes to the Telegraph.
Right.
And then it goes to New York City.
Yes.
And then somebody writes a story out of
Yes,
that.
yes.
And I'm just curious if you were able to trace any of these from the originating news article in England, the distillation, and then, the reblow up, and see if it was consistent throughout.
No, I wasn't able to do that, but I do know there were lots of inconsistencies, like what you're describing, because of all of what you just said. And when Daniel Craig took over as general manager, that was one of the things that he said. Not all telegraph operators are good writers or good journalists. Excellent telegraph operators could transmit that information quickly, but they didn't all have the journalist heart, I guess, or the journalist mindset. So that's why he was really disgusted in that period in 1850 of what was moving on the wires, because And there's actually some really good stuff in the book, quotes around that, where what he puts out a message to the staff that, like, they have to just, just give us the facts, and if there are important details, go into the details. And one of the telegraph operators replied and said, well, we make it up anyway. And I can't even remember the exact quote, but it's sort of like he was saying, well, we make it up anyway. You guys don't do anything when you get it, And so Craig was really not happy with that and sent a message that was not acceptable. So there definitely were inconsistencies. But I think the biggest shift was that Craig and the AP they had as their basic foundational cornerstone of journalism that it must be fact-based. And they would do the best that they could to confirm or whatever, but there were inconsistencies for sure.
Okay, the one here.
Thank you, Professor. So you had said that it took, you knew about this story, this chronicle, 40 years before you actually decided to write upon it.
Yes.
So my question is, once you did decide to write upon it and focus on it, how long did it actually take to do all of the extensive research and write this book
Okay.
on such a topic?
Yes, it took a long time, way longer than I thought it would. I did about 3 years of intensive research, really, either digitally or traveling to places. And then the pandemic hit. And so that kind of, everything was on hold for a year during that period. In the fall of 2021, I got back to it and wrote my first full draft. I had written bits and pieces, but I wrote my first full draft in 3 months in the fall of 2021. And that was like night and day pushing myself to get it on paper, because that's the hardest thing about writing, is getting it from here to there. And we resist doing it even though we know we have to, right? So, and then once I had that, 2021, I did that, and then I didn't do much on it until 2022 when I got the publisher, and then there were 3 years of revising, reordering. One of the first things they asked me to do was to lay out a timeline chronologically, because they were confused by the story. There was so much in it. And so yeah, it took 9 years. I know. And I remember when I was realizing that, I was like, wow, I'm really slow at this writing thing, But I have heard from many other writers who write history in particular, it can take a long time when you're doing the historical research.
Well, it's been 150 years, so I'm glad you did it finally.
Great talk.
Thank you so much.
I really enjoyed that. If I visited Cape Race,
Pardon?
if I visited the town of Cape Race, would there be any markers or
So
such
Cape
for that?
Race is not a town.
Oh, it's just the point.
It's a headland. There you
Okay.
go.
That's it.
And there's
Cape
a
Race, ladies and gentlemen.
and there's a lighthouse, of course. And then to the left, that's where the telegraph station,
Okay.
the telegraph hut was back in the day. That's now a museum called the Myrick Wireless Interpretation Center, because Cape Race also had later history that's interesting. Marconi was there around the turn of the century. So it's had a communications history since the beginning. But at one point, there was the Myrick family. They were the second family to move there to be the lighthouse keepers. So they're actually not in my book because it was before they arrived. But they were there for the entire time that lighthouse existed and was operational. And at one point in the early 1900s, there were 80 people on that so there was actually a little town there then of 80 people. About an hour's drive or a 45-minute drive from here west, you come to Portugal Cove south. And that's where the community is. And that's where the O'Learys were from. And it's the closest community to Cape Race. And so that's why I think the stories came through, my family there. And I will just say July 8th, if you want to go. I mean, it's an amazing place to visit. It really is, because you are at the edge of the continent, and you feel it when you're there. the expansiveness of that place, like, you know, I love it obviously, but everybody I've taken there is wowed by the place. So I encourage everybody to go. And if you want to go this year, July 8th, I'm going to be doing a launch at Cape Race.
Oh, wow.
Because when the book came out last year, it was closed because it was seasonal. And so I've been invited to bring it back. And so there's this, and then down the road from here is a place called Mistaken Point, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site now, and there's these old fossils there. So 12,000 people from around the world come to visit this isolated location now. And apparently all the visitors, when they come, they love this story because they know about it in brief. But now they have a book to support it. So, yeah, so it's going to be a great event to end. You know.
Order the books now.
Yeah, definitely.
So they get there for July 8th.
Totally, totally.
That would be my suggestion. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, Theresa.
Hi.
The EP, when it existed, it was during Confederation, Canada becoming a new country.
It was before that.
It was before that. Did it have any role in getting to tell internationally and within our country from Newfoundland all the way to British Columbia, use of the AP news medium?
That's a very good question because initially it was the New York Associated Press because the New York newspapers only cared about themselves and being informed in New York. But as things evolved and the telegraph went further west, the Western editors of newspapers didn't like what was going on with the NYAP, and there's a whole section in the book about that. And it actually is kind of a pivotal moment in Daniel Craig's career around that. I won't go into the details, but it is exactly what you say, that as it went west, they wanted access to the news just like, and so in I'm not sure exactly what year, but in that time frame, the NYAP was renamed the AP because it was no longer just focused on New York City. Yeah.
You should introduce the person who's sitting beside you,
Oh, yes.
just as another piece of the story.
This is my lovely wife, Cindy. And Cindy had the chance to teach Theresa in grade
High school.
9, 10,
9, 10, 11.
9, 10, 11.
She's my English high
And,
school teacher.
She taught English. So Theresa's liking of English literatures. come to-
It all started in
circle.
high school.
You must be pretty proud.
Yeah. She really, and Cindy really
Oh,
nurtured
yes,
my
yes,
love
yes.
of books and my love of story. And she also mentored me in public speaking, which is why I'm here today, because I did work in radio in my career. So I wasn't speaking to the public. I was in a studio all alone, nobody looking at me. But the public speaking that you taught me has come in handy.
Absolutely. 2 notes, Theresa, from the classroom, A+. But a note for
Love it.
those who may be visiting Newfoundland. You mentioned Marconi site, Signal Hill. It may be interesting for you to just make a comment about when the transatlantic cable was laid. Why not Cape Race, or was it Cape Race? What happened there?
Okay, it's true. The transatlantic telegraph story is quite amazing. They did not use Cape Race as the Newfoundland is closest to Ireland, so of course the telegraph history in Newfoundland is huge, and that's why the transatlantic telegraph went from Newfoundland to Ireland, right? And in Newfoundland, the first attempt with it was in 1858, and it failed. It succeeded actually for 2 weeks, and the world celebrated. Everywhere there were just joyful celebrations. They thought peace on earth was coming any moment. And 2 weeks later, it failed, and the world was despondent. It's true. And so then they had to go back to the drawing board and figure out. And they used a ship coming from England and a ship coming from Ireland and from Newfoundland, and they were meeting in the middle and connecting these cables. but it did fail, and it was because the material that was coating the telegraph cable was not strong enough to protect it from the water. And eventually, over the next, like from 1858 to 1866, because that's how long it took them, in 1866, they were able to, there was a new material that came on the scene called gutta perch. And it was really good at covering up those wires, and so it succeeded in 1866. But it was a huge, huge undertaking. And one of the things that's interesting about it is when Cyrus Field, who was the lead investor in New York, he, when he was approached to get involved in it, he didn't know, nobody knew at that point if it was possible. But in 1855, the Oceanography Institute in Washington had done a cable survey, a survey of the ocean floor. And they found that there was a plateau that was perfect for laying a cable on that could protect it and go. It didn't go all the way across, but it went far enough that it showed them they could do it. And that was really fascinating because they didn't know that they could do it, and only when they found out that information did it enable them to say, okay, we can actually do it. At the time, many people thought it was impossible. They also thought the electric telegraph was impossible. Like when Morse was working on the electric telegraph, lots of people didn't believe he would succeed. And so it was just a really interesting story, actually, the transatlantic telegraph. In the end, it went from Heart's Content in Newfoundland, which is sort of on the northern side of Newfoundland. Cape Race is on the southern side. And it went to Valencia, Ireland. And in 1866, it worked permanently, but there were 3 attempts to make it work. And one of the fun things that I learned, that I found very exciting, because Newfoundland's history is really big in the telegraph, a lot of families have history in that, is that in 1855, Cyrus Field brought his investors from New York to Cape Race, not to Cape Race, to St. John's and to Port aux Basques, because they were going to lay the cable between Port aux Basques and Sydney in Nova Scotia. And, sorry, I'm going to lose my train of thought again. Darn, what was I saying? Could you just twig me?
Cyrus Field, Port aux Basques.
Yeah, Heart's
Brought
Content,
people-
Heart's Content. And so the final thing went from Heart's Content to Valencia, Ireland. It had started in another place in Newfoundland. I don't know if I answered that.
Any other questions from the floor? Yes. I'll bring you the microphone.
The cable, was it a single wire or was it a dozen of them all stranded together?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a
Yeah.
very good question. I believe there was one cable that went across, but it connected in the middle. That's what I believe, but I don't want to be 100, like I'm not an expert on that part of the history.
Share a little bit of it.
But
Last
there-
year we had the chance to go and visit
Oh,
the place.
you went to
where
Heart's Content.
They laid a cable. The cable is about 8 inches diameter.
Yep, that's right.
And there is multiple wire within the cable.
Ah, okay, that is.
connects.
Okay.
And it's extraordinary as far as the weight. You can imagine kilometers and kilometers of that wire
Thousands
being
of
laid down at
miles.
the bottom of the floors.
Thousands of miles.
Each of that copper wire, was it a quarter of an inch or?
Approximately 3/16 to a quarter. Yeah.
Thank you, Eve.
Wow.
I love that.
Aerospace engineer.
Thanks so
That's
much.
consulting the hive.
That's perfect.
Tell people that when you look at that scene and it looks very sparse, if you haven't been to Newfoundland and Labrador and you go there, it's not the end of the earth. You can see the end of the earth.
I want to leave some time for people to chat with Theresa and also get a book and get it signed. And just thank you all for coming. We have journalism students, journalism teachers, journalism staff members, famous legendary CBC radio voices, the former president of the CBC, Tony Manera, I'm glad I managed to wave at you how to get how to get into the space. And Theresa, especially to you, thank you. And my last question is, because they always we teach people, what's the future hold? What's next? What's your next writing project?
Well, I don't know if I'll write a book. I might write a book or I might write a play, but the story is about my great Aunt Kitty. And she worked at the telegraph, she was a telegraph operator at Cape Race around, like she would have been in her early 20s, around the turn of this 20th century. So in the early from about 1900 to 1913, she worked there. She lived in Portugal Cove South, as far as I know, and went back and forth. And when I started working on this book, people I was talking about, I would tell them the two stories that Dad told me, the one about the AP News boat and Great Aunt Kitty. And when I came out with this book in the fall and did my book tour, everybody was like, well, where's Great Aunt Kitty? She's not in this book. So she is the focus of the next book, and the working title is Women on the Wire. And it's really about how the telegraph changed women's lives, because it was the first professional opportunity for women to work outside the home and to earn good money, because as we know, the telegraph paid good money. And my great Aunt Kitty, I mean, she was living in Newfoundland, working as a telegraph operator, earning cash in a cashless economy. Because at that time, fishermen only got credit at the store. They didn't get cash. They couldn't accumulate wealth. They couldn't save any money. And here she was, a woman in that environment, you know, earning that income. So I wanted to explore that. And there's many other stories that Dad told me about her. She was a real force, real force. And many people know about Great Aunt Kitty. So I just felt like it was the natural next step. And actually, I did a bunch of research in the archives around that when I was doing this research. So some of the research from that book is going to be going into the next book. Because on the south coast of Newfoundland, when they put the telegraph in the 1870s in Canada, that's when the post office took over the telegraph. And a lot of the people who were managing the post offices on the south coast of Newfoundland were women. They were postmistresses. There was a half a dozen of them. And I just found that really interesting. And one of the things I want to play with is that I do know that when the telegraph was on the go, when they weren't working, they talked. The telegraph operators all over, they talked, they gossiped. So I thought I'd have some fun with that.
Well, there's a seat for you here when you want to come and talk about that story.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me.
Sorry, there was one last, yeah.
When the radio got invented, how soon did cable along the Atlantic became obsolete, or is it still functioning?
Well, the telegraph continued to function for a long time. Yeah, I mean, even into the war years, right? The telegraph was used in the First and Second World War.
So both were functioning at the same time?
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. And Theresa is I'm gonna try to get her over to the book table right away. If you want to come and chat with her there, and anyone who would like a book, now is your opportunity. So thank you very much for coming out tonight.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming.